The challenge. The Nexari warship hung in orbit like a crystalline dagger, its faceted hull refracting starlight across Earth's atmosphere. Admiral James Harrison stood at the viewport of Orbital Station Alpha, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he studied the alien vessel. 3 weeks had passed since the Nexari Dominion had arrived at the edge of the Sol system, demanding humanity abandon its colonies in the Arcturus sector. Now they offered what they called a merciful alternative: ritual combat to determine the fate of those worlds. The ship's commander, Supreme Warrior Venra, had been explicit. One champion from each species would fight in single combat. The winner's civilization would gain undisputed control of the contested systems. The loser would withdraw all claims. It was, the Nexari insisted, their most honored tradition, one that had served them for 10,000 years of expansion. "They're waiting for our response, sir," Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez said, approaching with a tablet displaying the latest analysis of Nexari combat capabilities. The data was intimidating. Their warriors stood nearly 3 meters tall, with crystalline exoskeletons capable of deflecting most conventional weapons. Their strength was estimated at 5 times that of an average human. Harrison turned from the viewport, his expression grim. "And our options? The Joint Chiefs are divided. We could refuse the challenge, try to defend the colonies militarily. But their tech advantage." Rodriguez trailed off. They both knew the projections. An open war would cost millions of lives, with no guarantee of victory. "And if we accept?" "They've transmitted the rules of engagement. Personal combat only, no powered armor or ranged weapons. They're allowing each side to choose their own melee weapons within specified parameters." Rodriguez hesitated. "Sir, their champion. The footage we have of their previous ritual combats is concerning." Harrison nodded. He'd watched those recordings. The Nexari warrior had dismembered its last opponent, a Centaurian brute twice its size, in less than 2 minutes. "Have we identified any potential champions of our own?" Military Command has forwarded their recommendations: top Special Forces operators, combat specialists. Rodriguez called up the list on his tablet. "But there's also this." Harrison took the tablet, his eyebrows rising as he read the unexpected entry. "Sarah Chen, the dancer. Former dancer. She served 4 tours with the 23rd Special Tactics, sir. Perfect combat record. But that's not why she's on the list." Rodriguez called up a video. This is from 6 months ago, when her unit encountered a Nexari scout ship. The footage showed a close-quarters fight aboard the alien vessel, while her teammates engaged with conventional tactics. Chen moved differently. Her motions were fluid, unpredictable. A deadly dance that the crystalline aliens couldn't track. She disabled 3 of them before they even managed to land a blow. "Their combat algorithms are based on geometric precision," Rodriguez explained. "They predict movement patterns, analyze attack vectors. But Chen, she doesn't fight like a soldier. She fights like a dancer. Their systems can't process it." Harrison watched the video loop again, something like hope kindling in his eyes. The Nexari were ancient, proud, set in their ways. They expected warfare to follow certain rules, certain patterns. But humanity had always excelled at breaking patterns. "Where is she now?" "Teaching combat medicine at the Luna Academy, sir. She retired from active duty last year after that engagement." Harrison straightened his uniform. "Contact her immediately, and inform the Nexari that we accept their challenge." Aboard their ship, the Nexari received humanity's response with crystalline laughter. Their champion, Kazthar the Undefeated, watched the transmission with his faceted eyes gleaming in amusement. These soft, fragile creatures thought they could stand against the Dominion's greatest warrior. He had broken 18 champions across 12 star systems. This human would be 19. But as Sarah Chen received the call that would change her life, she was neither training nor preparing for battle. Instead, she was dancing alone in her quarters, moving to music only she could hear. The same way she had every morning since childhood. Her muscles remembered every lesson, every performance, every combat engagement, weaving them together into something entirely new. Something the Nexeri had never seen before. The preparation. The training facility deep beneath Luna Base hummed with activity as Sarah Chen studied the holographic projections surrounding her. Each showed a different angle of Nexeri combat footage, crystalline warriors moving with geometric precision through their ancient forms. Their movements were beautiful in their own way, she thought, but predictable, like a curriculum that hadn't changed in millennia. Their weak points are few, Colonel Zhang explained, manipulating the display to highlight specific areas on the Nexeri anatomy. The joint sections where the crystalline plates meet are vulnerable, but they're experts at protecting these areas. No champion has successfully exploited them in recorded history. Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on something else, the way the Nexeri warriors planted their feet before each strike. Their incredible strength required a solid foundation, which meant commitment to each movement. There was no flow, no improvisation. Every attack was a complete statement, with a clear beginning and end. "I need to see their losses," she said quietly. Zhang paused. There aren't many, only 3 recorded defeats in their ritual combat history, and those were against species with significant physical advantages. "Show me anyway." The holograms shifted, displaying 3 brief, brutal encounters. Sarah watched each multiple times, her eyes narrowing. "There, freeze that moment." The image paused on a Nexeri champion stumbling after an unexpected direction change from their opponent. They don't recover well from interrupted sequences. They're combat programming. "More like religious doctrine," Zhang interjected. The Nexeri believe their fighting style was gifted to them by their gods. Each move is considered sacred. Deviating from the forms is unthinkable to them. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Then we make them think the unthinkable." Across the vacuum of space, aboard the Nexeri vessel, Casthar was also preparing, though preparation meant something very different to him. He stood in the sacred chamber of combat, surrounded by crystalline monuments to fallen warriors, performing the exact same movements his ancestors had performed for 10,000 years. Every angle was precise, every strike perfectly aligned with ancient geometry. "The human female is unusual," his second, Vertak, reported. "Our analysis shows irregular combat patterns in her military record." Casthar didn't pause his ritual. "Irregularity is weakness. Their chaos will shatter against our precision." Some advisors suggest caution. Her last encounter with our forces showed nothing but luck. Casthar interrupted, his crystalline form catching the light as he completed another perfect sequence. "In proper ritual combat, there is no room for their primitive improvisation. The forms are absolute." Vertak bowed and retreated, leaving the champion to his preparation. But had he stayed, he might have noticed something troubling in the holographic battle recordings playing silently in the background. The way the human female moved like water around solid stone, finding paths that shouldn't exist. Back on Luna, Sarah had switched from observation to action. She moved through the training room in a blur of motion, engaging holographic Nexeri opponents programmed with their standard combat patterns. But she wasn't fighting. She was dancing. "This is unorthodox," Admiral Harrison remarked from the observation deck, watching as Sarah flowed between strikes that should have demolished her, turning the Nexeri's strength against them. "She's rewriting her neural patterns," the base's chief medical officer explained, combining her dance background with combat muscle memory, creating something the Nexeri computers won't be able to predict because it's never existed before. Below them, Sarah spun away from a crushing blow, her movement becoming a strike of its own. The holographic Nexeri shattered, its programming unable to compute the angle of attack. But she was already moving to the next sequence, each step flowing into another like a performance where every movement could mean survival. The days passed quickly. While Casthar performed his ritual preparations with unchanging precision, Sarah worked with a team of xenobiologists, and combat specialists to understand every aspect of Nexeri physiology. She learned that their crystalline structure, while incredibly strong, transmitted vibrations in predictable ways. A strike to one plate would resonate through others in patterns that could be anticipated if you understood the geometry. Like dancing on ice, she explained to Harrison during one of her brief rest periods. Their strength is also their weakness. They're too perfect, too structured. They've never needed to adapt. And you believe you can exploit that? Sarah's eyes held a quiet confidence. Their combat style is like classical ballet. Beautiful, precise, traditional. But I was trained in classical and modern dance. I can switch styles mid-movement, flow from structure to chaos and back again. They won't expect that. They can't expect that. The night before the duel, two very different scenes played out on opposite sides of the void. In his sacred chamber, Caspar performed the final rites, his movements matching exactly those of every champion before him. Each step had been calculated over millennia to achieve maximum efficiency. There was no room for doubt in his mind, only the pure certainty of geometric perfection. In her quarters on Luna Base, Sarah Chen danced. Not to prepare, not to train, but simply to move. Her body flowed through classical forms that dissolved into contemporary chaos, each transition natural as breathing. On her tablet, declarations of support poured in from across human space, not just from soldiers and politicians, but from dancers, artists, athletes. People who understood that humanity's greatest strength was not in its perfection, but in its endless capacity to create something new. Tomorrow, these two approaches would meet in combat, the unchanging geometry of the past versus the fluid adaptation of the present, perfection versus creativity. And in the space between the stars, the fate of two civilizations hung in the balance. The arena, the dueling chamber aboard the Nexeri vessel, defied normal human concepts of architecture. Its walls were crystalline sheets arranged in perfect geometric patterns, each surface reflecting light in carefully calculated ways. The floor was a single piece of transparent crystal, beneath which the stars themselves seemed to wheel past. It was beautiful, Sarah thought, in the same way mathematics was beautiful, precise, orderly, absolute. Representatives from both species lined the chamber's hexagonal perimeter. The humans stood rigid with tension, while the Nexeri maintained their characteristic stillness, their crystalline forms catching and refracting the chamber's light. Above them all, a hemisphere of recording drones hovered silently, broadcasting the historic encounter to billions across both civilizations. Sarah wore a simple black combat suit, its surface treated to provide some protection against the crystalline weapons the Nexeri favored. In her hands, she held a staff of reinforced titanium alloy, light enough for quick movement, strong enough to withstand Nexeri strikes. She had chosen it over traditional weapons after studying how vibrations propagated through crystalline structures. The chamber's main doors parted in a precisely calculated sequence, and Caspar entered. Sarah had seen recordings, but they didn't capture the sheer presence of a Nexeri champion. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his crystalline exoskeleton arranged in overlapping plates that caught the light like facets of a diamond. In his hands, he held a traditional crystal blade that seemed to hum at a frequency just below human hearing. "The human sends a dancer to face me." His voice resonated through the chamber, the crystalline walls amplifying his amusement. "Your species truly understands nothing of combat." Sarah didn't respond. She was too busy observing his movement patterns, the way his weight shifted with each step. Everything was exactly as the recordings had shown. Perfect, precise, predictable. Supreme Warrior Venera stepped forward, her own crystalline form slightly more elaborate than her warriors. "The terms have been agreed upon. Combat will continue until submission or incapacitation. The victor's species will gain full rights to the contested systems. There will be no interference from either side." She paused, her faceted eyes sweeping the chamber. "Take your positions." Sarah and Caspar moved to opposite sides of a central circle etched into the crystal floor. The human delegation held its breath. This was the moment humanity had prepared for, yet none of them truly knew what to expect. Sarah Chen's training sessions had been kept classified, her strategy known only to a select few. "Begin," Venra commanded. Kazthar moved instantly, his blade describing a perfect arc through the air, as he covered the distance between them in 2 massive strides. It was the opening move of the sacred form, executed flawlessly as it had been for 10,000 years. The blow would have cleaved any normal opponent in half. But Sarah wasn't there. She had already begun moving before his attack started, her body flowing away from the predicted arc in a motion that seemed to defy the chamber's geometric perfection. The Nexari blade passed through empty air as she spun past his guard, her staff striking one of his joint sections with precise force. The impact wasn't powerful, but it didn't need to be. The vibration resonated through Kazthar's crystalline structure exactly as Sarah had calculated, causing him to stumble slightly. It was a tiny imperfection in his movement, but to the watching Nexari, it was shocking. Their champions' forms were never meant to include recovery from imbalance. "Impossible," Kazthar growled, turning to face her. "No opponent moves before the attack begins." Sarah was already in motion again, her movements flowing from one form to another without pause or pattern. "Your attacks begin before you move," she replied calmly. "Your weight shift, your crystal's resonance, everything announces what comes next." Fury flashed across Kazthar's faceted features. He launched into the second sacred form, a complex series of strikes designed to overcome defensive positions. Each blow came with perfect force and precision, each angle mathematically optimized for combat effectiveness. But fighting Sarah was like fighting smoke. She didn't block or parry in ways the Nexari combat computers could understand. Instead, she transformed each defensive movement into an attack of its own, flowing between forms that existed in no combat manual. Her staff struck Kazthar's joints and plates in seemingly random patterns, each impact sending carefully calculated vibrations through his crystalline form. The chamber's audience watched in stunned silence. The humans hadn't expected this level of speed and grace from their champion, while the Nexari struggled to process combat that refused to follow their sacred patterns. Admiral Harrison allowed himself a small smile as he watched Sarah turn combat into choreography. Kazthar's frustration mounted with each failed sequence. His attacks became stronger, faster, but also more rigid in their adherence to traditional forms. It was as if he was trying to impose geometric order on chaos itself. "Fight properly," he roared after another perfect strike met empty air. "I am fighting," Sarah responded, flowing around his guard to land another precise hit. "Just not by your rules." The duel continued, becoming something neither species had quite seen before. It was combat and dance, chaos and precision, tradition and innovation all at once. The Nexari champion's superior strength and reach meant that any direct hit would end the fight instantly. But landing such a hit on an opponent who moved like water through crystal was proving impossible. Sarah wasn't just avoiding damage, she was systematically targeting specific points on Kazthar's crystalline structure. Each strike sent vibrations through his form, the resonance patterns building upon each other in ways the Nexari had never considered possible. Small fracture lines began to appear in his outer plates, spreading in geometric patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so threatening. "This is not combat," Kazthar protested as he launched into the fourth sacred form. "This is abomination." Sarah ducked under a blow that would have taken her head off, her movement becoming a spin that brought her staff up against another key joint. "This is adaptation," she corrected him. "Something your people forgot how to do 10,000 years ago." The impact resonated through Kazthar's entire form, connecting with the stress patterns from her previous strikes. A crystalline plate on his arm shattered unexpectedly, sending a shock through the assembled Nexari. Never in recorded history had a challenger managed to breach a champion's outer defenses so early in combat. But as fragments of crystal rained onto the perfect floor, Kazthar's movements suddenly changed. Something primitive and desperate crept into his geometric perfection, the first hints of adaptation forced by survival instinct. His next attack came at an angle that violated the sacred forms, driven by rage and fear rather than tradition. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. The duel was about to enter a new phase, one that even she hadn't fully predicted. The question was no longer whether the Nexari champion could defeat her with traditional combat. The question was what would happen when she forced him to abandon tradition entirely. Breaking point. The shattering of Kazthar's crystalline plate changed everything. The perfect geometry of the chamber seemed to waver as the Nexari champion's movements became increasingly erratic. His next strike came in a wild arc that violated 3 separate tenets of the sacred forms, forcing Sarah to abandon her planned sequence and improvise. "What have you done to me?" Kazthar's voice held something the Nexari observers had never heard before. Fear, not of defeat, but of change. His body was moving in ways that 10,000 years of tradition said were impossible, responding to instincts older than the sacred forms themselves. Sarah rolled under another unconventional strike, but this time she wasn't quite fast enough. The crystal blade caught her left arm, leaving a deep gash that immediately began seeping red onto the perfect floor. The human observers tensed, but she moved through the pain, incorporating it into her flow just as she'd learned to dance through injuries years ago. "I haven't done anything to you," she responded, her breathing controlled despite the wound. "You're doing it yourself. You're adapting." The words seemed to strike Kazthar harder than any physical blow. His crystalline form shuddered, sending cascading patterns of light across the chamber walls. More fractures appeared in his plates, spreading not from Sarah's strikes this time, but from the stress of movements his structure wasn't designed to perform. Among the observers, Supreme Warrior Venra watched with growing concern. The sacred combat rituals had never produced a scenario like this. The human wasn't just fighting their champion. She was forcing him to evolve, to break patterns that were fundamental to Nexari identity. "This must stop," one of her advisors whispered. "He's violating the forms. The combat is impure." "No," Venra responded, her voice holding a new understanding. "The combat is revealing something we forgot. Watch." On the crystal floor, the duel had transformed into something unprecedented. Kazthar's movements were a desperate mixture of geometric precision and raw instinct. Each time he tried to return to the sacred forms, Sarah's fluid attacks forced him to improvise again. More of his plates were cracking, but he was also landing glancing blows that left Sarah increasingly battered. Blood ran down her left arm, and a hit to her ribs made each breath painful. Yet she maintained her dance, each movement flowing into the next regardless of injury. The human observers recognized something in her performance now. The same determination that had carried their species through countless challenges, the refusal to break even when breaking seemed inevitable. "You bleed," Kazthar roared, frustration overriding his fear as he launched another unorthodox attack. "You're fragile. How do you continue?" Sarah's response was to spin inside his guard, using his own momentum to send him staggering across the floor. "Because this isn't about who's stronger," she gasped, pressing her advantage. "It's about who can adapt faster." The impact of her staff against his damaged plates sent new resonance patterns through his crystalline form. But instead of the calculated vibrations she'd used earlier, these were chaotic, unpredictable. Kazthar screamed, the first time any human had heard such a sound from a Nexari. More plates shattered, not from the force of the blow, but from the internal stress of movements that violated their geometric structure. The Nexari champion fell to one knee, his perfect form now webbed with fractures. Yet somehow he rose again, moving in ways that made his own people flinch with their wrongness. "I am the undefeated," he growled, but his voice held uncertainty. "I am perfect." "Nothing is perfect," Sarah replied, though she was swaying slightly from blood loss now. "That's what makes us strong." The next exchange was brutal. Kazthar abandoned all pretense of following the sacred forms, fighting with desperate instinct that made him more dangerous than ever. His crystal blade opened new wounds on Sarah's shoulder and leg, while her staff continued to exploit the growing weaknesses in his structure. Both champions were failing, but neither would yield. The chamber's perfect acoustics carried every sound to the observers: the crack of crystal, the impact of staff against plate, the harsh breathing of the human, and the rising keen of stressed crystalline structures. The display was both beautiful and terrible, a demonstration of what happens when immovable tradition meets unstoppable change. Sarah's vision was beginning to blur from blood loss, her movements losing some of their fluid grace. But each time she stumbled, she recovered with the same determination that had carried her through years of dance training and combat missions. Her staff struck with less precision now, but each hit still contributed to the spreading network of stress fractures in Kazthar's form. The Nexari champion was barely recognizable as the perfect warrior who had entered the chamber. His crystalline plates were a maze of cracks, parts of his structure threatening to fall away entirely. Yet he fought on, driven by something beyond tradition now, a primitive survival instinct his species had buried beneath geometry and ritual. Both warriors recognized that the end was approaching. Neither could continue much longer. Sarah from blood loss, Kazthar from structural failure. The next exchange would decide everything. They moved simultaneously, each drawing on their last reserves of strength. Sarah's staff and Kazthar's blade traced intersecting arcs through the chamber's perfect light. Time seemed to slow as both weapons found their marks. The impact resonated through the chamber like a crystal bell's final note. For a moment, both champions stood frozen in their final positions, connected by crossed weapons and shared pain. Then the complex network of fractures in Kazthar's form began to spread, connecting and multiplying as 10,000 years of rigid perfection finally reached its breaking point. But even as his crystalline structure began to fail catastrophically, the Nexari champion made a choice that would reshape his species' future. Instead of struggling to maintain his shattered perfection, he let go of his weapon and reached out with a cracked hand to catch Sarah as she finally collapsed from her wounds. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was her opponent's crystalline form catching the light in entirely new patterns, no longer perfect, but perhaps stronger for having been broken and reformed. The fate of two civilizations hung on what would happen next. Legacy. Sarah Chen woke in the medical bay of Orbital Station Alpha 3 days after the duel. The first thing she noticed was the unusual light, crystalline refraction patterns dancing across the ceiling. The second was the tall figure standing motionlessly by her bed. "You've changed us," Supreme Warrior Venra said without preamble. Her crystalline form caught the light differently now, with subtle variations in its geometric patterns that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "Some say you've destroyed us." Sarah tried to sit up, wincing at the pull of healing wounds. "And what do you say?" "I say you've reminded us of something we forgot 10,000 years ago." Venra's faceted eyes studied her with newfound curiosity. "That perfection is stagnation." The medical bay's door slid open, admitting Admiral Harrison, and to Sarah's surprise, Kazthar. The Nexari champion's crystalline structure had been partially rebuilt, but not to its original perfect geometry. Instead, the new plates incorporated the fracture patterns from the duel, creating something that was both ordered and chaotic. "The sacred combat ritual has never ended this way," Kazthar said, his voice holding a complexity that hadn't existed before. "There was no clear victor. I suffered catastrophic structural failure, but I was still functioning when you lost consciousness. The traditional laws don't account for such an outcome." "Then perhaps," Sarah suggested, "the laws need to adapt too." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. For the Nexari, adaptation had been heresy. Now it was becoming necessity. "We've spent the last 3 days in negotiation," Harrison explained. "The Nexari High Command has been revolutionized by what they witnessed. The footage of your duel has sparked something like a cultural renaissance among their people." Venra nodded. "Already, Our younger warriors are experimenting with modified forms. Some are even attempting to incorporate fluid movements into their training. It's unprecedented and terrifying, and perhaps exactly what we needed. The contested systems, Sarah asked, remembering the original stakes, will be jointly colonized, Harrison said with a slight smile. The Nexari have proposed a cooperative arrangement. They believe there might be advantages to combining our different approaches. Kazthar stepped forward, moving with a grace that somehow merged crystalline precision with organic flow. You showed us that strength can take many forms. That change doesn't mean weakness. He paused, his reconstructed plates catching the light in complex patterns. I have been appointed to lead a new initiative, studying how our combat traditions can evolve without losing their essence. The religious authorities are in an uproar, Venra added, a hint of amusement in her harmonic voice. But they cannot deny what everyone saw. A human dancer forced our greatest champion to adapt, and in doing so, made him stronger. Sarah looked down at her hands, still bearing the marks of combat. I didn't fight to destroy your traditions, she said quietly. I fought to survive them. Sometimes that's all humanity does. Survive, adapt, change. It's not perfect, but it's how we grow. Perfect, Kazthar repeated thoughtfully. I understood that word once. Now I think I understand something better. Over the following months, the impact of the duel rippled through both civilizations. The Nexari began a careful re-examination of their rigid traditions, looking for ways to incorporate change without losing their identity. Young warriors studied the footage of Sarah's combat dance, learning that strength could flow as well as stand firm. Human colonies in the joint systems soon featured crystalline architecture that moved in ways that would have been blasphemous before, while Nexari structures began incorporating organic curves alongside their geometric patterns. The two species found they had more to learn from each other than either had imagined. Sarah recovered fully and was asked to teach at a newly established joint combat academy, where human and Nexari warriors trained together, each learning from the other's strengths. Her classes became famous for combining traditional Nexari forms with human adaptability, creating something entirely new. Kazthar, no longer called the Undefeated, but perhaps now respected even more, often visited to spar with her. Their matches became lessons in themselves, demonstrations of how opposition could transform into cooperation, how conflict could lead to growth. 1 year after the duel, Sarah stood in the Academy's crystalline training chamber, watching her mixed class of human and Nexari students move through forms that would have been impossible a year ago. The chamber's walls, once perfect in their geometry, now incorporated subtle variations that made them stronger. Was this what you imagined? Kazthar asked, standing beside her, when you first stepped into the dueling chamber. Sarah shook her head, smiling. I just wanted to survive, to protect our colonies. She gestured at the students, at the harmony of rigid strength and fluid grace they were achieving. This is better. Better than perfect, Kazthar agreed, his reconstructed form catching the light in patterns that were uniquely his own. Above them, through the crystalline ceiling, the stars wheeled past in their ancient patterns. But now, both species understood that even the most ancient patterns could change, could adapt, could grow into something new and unexpected and wonderful. It wasn't perfect. It was better than that. It was alive.